welcome to the May 2020 grads panel. I'm so grateful for Jack and Katie and Grace to be here. Estella might be joining us a little bit later, so I'm crossing fingers she does. I'm Jackie Banks. I'm the Arts, Media, and Communication Advisor here at Colley. Welcome. So we're just going to dive right in because I promised all of you that we will be out at 12:55, so you can have 5-minute break before you do whatever you do at 1 o'clock. So we're just going to do the Georgetown 411, which is your name, the major that what you graduated with. You're all May 2020 grads, so there's no surprise there. And a little bit about what you're doing now. So for some of you, it's like, this is what I'm doing. It's one job title. And for others, it's like, here's a little bit I'm doing in this space, and here's what I'm doing in this space. And if you're doing freelancing, please tell students about that as well. So I'm just going to go by who's on my screen first. And Jack, since you came in first, you are up first.
Oh, okay, cool. My name is Jack Reichert. I graduated in 2020 from the SFS with a degree in global business. Some things I was involved with at Georgetown, I was like on the swim team, I did improv, and now I am living in New York City. I work primarily as a freelance production assistant. What that entails is basically I work for like 3 to 7 weeks on different projects, sometimes as short as 1 week, and when those end, I have like a network of people that I've grown out for myself that I reach out to, and almost always I can then get a job through that. Some shows that I've worked on that you guys might have heard of are Rachel Ray's 30-Minute Meals, Real Housewives of New Jersey, and then there's a show that you guys are probably going to hear about called Only Murders in the Building that I worked on. It's a Hulu show with Steve Martin, Martin Short, Selena Gomez, and I just finished working as a production coordinator for a reality TV show called Starting Over with Nate and Jeremiah. In addition to being a production assistant, my big dream is to sort of be like a screenwriter and a stand-up comedian. So I do stand-up comedy every night. I was back in DC like a month and a half ago where I opened for Tony Woods. Tony Woods was a Def Jam comic. And he was Dave Chappelle's mentor, so I opened for him at the Arlington Draft House and Cinema. It was a ton of fun. I've also opened for Jacob Williams from Wild 'N Out, and I've done like some other stuff with that. I do a lot of stand-up. I also post my stand-up to social media. I have like a small presence on there. And then I also work for Mike Birbiglia as like a podcast analytics production assistant sort of person. So yeah, I've gotten my foot in a lot of different doors, and I'm all trying to get to one goal as fast as I possibly can.
Thanks, Jack. And I'm sorry, it's like as I was listening to kind of the list of things, you were saying you're trying to get to that one thing. Do you know what the one thing is? And you might have said it, and sorry if I'm making you repeat it. What is the one thing?
So my one thing, I want to have a Netflix special. I want to have like a stand-up Netflix comedy hour. That's my big goal. But like if someone was like, oh, we want you to be on a TV show, or we want you to write for a TV show, I'm much more of a writer than I am as like anything else. So any sort of like writing job, but I think that before I get one of those jobs, I think that the big thing is like a comedy hour, like a special.
That's awesome. Okay. Thanks, Jack. Okay, Katie, you are up next.
Sure. Hi, I'm Katie Stanton. Like Jackie said, May 2020 grad. I graduated from the college. I majored in women's and gender studies and minored in journalism. So while I was an undergrad, I kind of caught the bug for journalism, really wanted to be a reporter, interned at a couple of different places, wrote for La Jolla a lot. And after I graduated, I ended up being on the job hunt for a couple of months and actually ended up landing a job in science communications. So I currently work as a social media specialist at an organization called the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine in Washington, D.C., and I basically do a lot of social media management for them, primarily around sharing events and some paid campaigns. We have a big event this weekend. That's our annual meeting, as well as an event with the Nobel Prize organization, which is really cool. But again, kind of like what Jack said, I want to go into journalism. So on the side, beyond what I do at NASM, I also freelance for Georgetown's SFS alumni magazine. I've written a couple pieces for them that are supposed to come out in the next week or two, as well as for my local paper, the Winstead Phoenix, which is like a small hometown paper. I volunteer write for them. And then in addition to that, I also work with GEMA, which is Georgetown's Entertainment and Media Alliance. Hopefully a lot of people have heard of it. It's a great organization. And so I work with Rich Batista, who's the chair of GEMA, to write their monthly newsletter, the GEMA Gist. And then alongside that, I also do a little bit of freelance social media consulting with some authors, including an author named Jim Campbell, who just wrote a book about Bernie Madoff, which became a lot more relevant last week, which is really interesting. But yeah, I mean, I do, I'm wearing a lot of different hats, but if I could pick and choose, I would be a reporter and would be putting my nose to the grindstone there. But, as Jackie mentioned, it's a tough industry, and I'm hoping to kind of build a freelance portfolio to eventually move, into journalism adjacent jobs. And that could also be doing something like audience development or social media engagement for a newspaper. So that's kind of a little bit about me.
Thanks, Katie. Okay, Grace.
Awesome. Well, my name is Grace Don Obedien. Again, May 2020 grad, the lucky year. At Georgetown, I was a double major in government and Arabic, and I was also on the rowing team. But now it's interesting because I'm in PR, which is a little like, how did she get there? How did she go from Arabic to PR? But while I was at Georgetown, I was involved with the Georgetown Stories Club, which was where we would manage like a first person kind of documentary series that was fully digital. And we would post on Georgetown social media channels and YouTube channel. And so that's kind of what got me interested in the digital space. Now I graduated and I had no idea what I wanted to do. And so we can talk about this later, but I did a bunch of networking. I actually did one of GEMA's micro internships, which was social media management, which was awesome. And then eventually I met a Georgetown grad who led me to PR. So right now I work at Weber Shandwick, which is a global PR agency. And my title is Digital Junior Associate. So some things that entails, it's very broad, but we do some newsletter marketing, social media, like creation, where we work with the creative team to pull that together. So a lot of moving parts. And then we also do some consulting. So like we will advise our clients on how to respond to certain events on social. Like, for example, the murder of George Floyd, we had to advise them, like, maybe you should pause your paid or earned media today, or you should post this. So we advise them in that way, which is really cool. And that job is fully remote, but I've still been absolutely loving it. And then on the side, I do some freelance work where I do some social media management for an author, which is really awesome. I feel like I get to tap into that more of that creative side through the freelancing. And it's also just nice having something else to do on the side of my normal job. So that is about it for me.
Thanks, guys. And as you're talking, I just scribbled on the side freelancing and I circled it because I don't have it as a question, but it's all of you are doing that. So as I'm going through some questions, and if I have time, noodle on what it means to freelance. Paid, the unpaid, and what does it mean to you? Because freelance is so big. What does that look like? The other piece that I wanted to ask about is COVID, how it impacted your industries. And you may not have the in front of you, like the hardcore data. But if you recall back to being about this time, so we're looking at kind of the that January through maybe April, May space, because I'm thinking like, when do students really start looking for jobs and start getting panicked about not having jobs? What did it look like then when you were looking? And from your vantage point now, how do you feel like COVID is still impacting your industries? And if you're not quite sure, don't worry about it, but I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on it.
So I can go first with that. So when COVID hit, I went home and I stayed at home until September because I just didn't know what I was doing. And I had saved up some money throughout college, and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to move to New York. I'm just going to, because New York opened and LA hadn't. I knew that I wanted to go the production assistant route. So I just moved to New York. I was applying to jobs, wasn't getting any jobs because so there are so few jobs now at this point because they shut down so many productions. And so I was like, why did I move to New York? And then one day I very luckily just ran into some people filming on the side of the street in New York. And I went, you know what? I'm going to walk on set and I'm going to tell them about myself and ask them if they had a job. And I started doing that. And that's been how I get all of my jobs. All of my jobs come from me showing up to people and offering them for me to work for them unsolicitedly. And like 1 in every 3 times, like I get a job out of it. So like literally after this, I have to email someone that I met a week ago and basically be like, hey, like, do you need any work next week? And I just met him on the street. That's how it's been working for me, I guess.
No, that's helpful, Jack, because it's productions are still, I mean, there's still some going on. They're still closed, or it's like this, so it's challenging. So you had to be pretty proactive in that space. So, and I'm curious, Grace or Katie, you have anything to kind of reflect on and that process when you were looking and how it still looks in the industries that you're interested in now?
Sure, I can go quickly. So in terms of COVID, it's interesting because I think if it never happened, I would be in a job in an industry that, frankly, I'm not super interested in. COVID really made me kind of take a step back, and because we went home, obviously, and I really had to think about like, what do I want to do? What do I want to spend my future doing? So that gave me so much time to have a ton of networking calls. And I spoke with so many people, like an executive producer at the Olympics. I spoke with some PR agencies, some like sports companies, a bunch of different work. And then it really gave me like a broad view to figure out what I do want to do. In terms of how COVID affected my specific industry. So I'm in PR, like I said, and I think the hiring was definitely a lot lower than normal. And so finally they opened it back up to interns in the fall. And so while my ideal wasn't really interning again the fall after graduation, sorry, it's a little loud outside. I realized that was a good opportunity for me to see if I do really like PR and if I want to pursue it. So starting in October, I did accept an internship with my company. They didn't have a ton of interns because, again, their budget was a bit lower because clients have been stopping their social media campaigns, paid campaigns. But I've noticed that throughout the course of the internship, and now I was hired full-time in January, they're starting to pull on a lot more interns and really make the classes bigger. So in that regard, I feel hopeful for future graduates that there are opportunities coming back up. I know that like our teams are super busy these days because we're a bit understaffed, but we're noticing that clients are really starting to pick up their work. So that's a positive sign.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks, Grace. And Katie, journalism. I feel like that's just journalism, talk journalism.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think for me, it's one of the industries that was just fully gutted, not only by COVID, but prior to COVID. I mean, I was going into my senior spring knowing it was going to be challenging to find a position, especially one that was full-time or more than an internship or a fellowship. And so I had maybe a couple of applications and leads in like right during spring break. And, there were times when I would be talking to a recruiter or talking to an editor and they would get laid off. It was just a really aggressive time. And as much as I want to say, kind of like what Grace and Jack were saying, that it's maybe come full circle and been repaired, I don't think I can even say that because there's entire newsrooms that are being either bought out or, staff that's been laid off. And that really impacted my job hunt in a lot of different ways because it made the few positions that, are existing incredibly competitive. I used to talk to Jackie about some of the numbers, and there was an NPR internship I applied to, I think it was for last fall, where the acceptance rate was 0.1%. So it was a level of like obscene numbers. There was no way to even try to get your foot in the door. And I did a lot of networking. That was like something that was really helpful for me, especially in the summer after I graduated, just to talk to people about, what they thought was the best practice given COVID, all these different things. And the hardest thing is no one really knew what to do. There wasn't a lot of direction I could get. I could get tips about how they did their path. But if it was, someone who's further in their career, it looks completely different now. Or someone who's younger, they say, well, in my first 3 years after college, I bounced between 3 newsrooms because I got laid off 3 times, So for me, it got to a point after I graduated where, I was doing some unpaid work and like a tiny bit of freelancing, but I needed, a solid income. And so I turned more towards communications, which for me, and I talked to Jackie about this a lot, was still getting the writing and the experience component I wanted, even though it wasn't exactly what I wanted to do. And I also set some caveats for myself as to what kind of work in communications I'd be willing to do. And for me, being in science communications, it's communications with a certain message that I agreed with. And that's why I feel comfortable with it. But it's a challenge even now. Like I kind of felt like, oh, this is something I'll do for 6 months to a year. And then, journalism will open back up and there'll be all these positions. And even the positions I do find that are open, the issue with all these layoffs is sometimes I'm competing against, 10, 20-year veterans in the industry for an entry-level position, which is really challenging. And freelancing has really, as we just touched on, been a really helpful thing for me to keep my writing skills up and to keep my passions going while also, getting the income that I need and being able to move to the city I want to be in. So back to kind of COVID, it really just, when I've talked to people about it, exasperated the issues that were already happening in the industry. And the uncertainty has been the hardest part. I'm sure that's the case for every different job area, but no one knows what it's going to look like and how it's going to get repaired and what those jobs are going to look like. So, I steered my path in a slightly different direction, but I'm still able to get kind of the fun passions that I want out of it. And I don't know what it'll look like 6 months or a year from now, but I'm, still trying to be hopeful and realizing that I've still landed on my feet, even though kind of like what Grace said, it wasn't anywhere close to what I imagined it would look like.
Thanks. That was very helpful. I think as the three of you represent industries that I have questions from students all the time. So your frankness about it is incredibly helpful. So I was going to go to networking, but I'm going to come back to freelancing because it's something that all of you kind of mentioned in your intros and continue to reference. So I guess a couple things I'm curious about. Usually I get from students, and you were students not too long ago, is what is freelancing? So maybe what is freelancing to you? Is it a paid thing? Is it an unpaid thing? How did you even go about doing it? So I think maybe play in that space, play in the freelancing space. So if a student was interested in, say, Grace, I think you said you were freelancing with, was it social media, I think? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So maybe play in that space. And Katie, you're doing some journalism freelancing, right? And then Jack, pretty much all of what you're doing is freelancing. So yeah, talk to me about what that means for you. And if you were advising students who are interested in learning more about it, and anyone can start.
Sure, I can start. So freelancing for me is paid, thankfully, and it's the hourly rate is actually much higher than my normal PR job, which is always a bonus. So it's like extra motivating when you have some time on the weekends to like work on your freelancing stuff. That it's really worth it. And frankly, it's just really fun. I love the work. And so I started freelancing actually through the GMA View project, like the micro internship. So, sorry, it's so loud. So I was connected. Like I said, I did social media for that woman in that View project. And then she really liked my work. And so she reached out to someone who I think posted on Facebook, like, I'm looking for a social media manager, nothing crazy, but I would love some help. And she put my name down because she knew I was also looking for a job at the time. I still didn't have a job. And so I was connected with her. We worked great together. She told me what her expectations were. And for the most part, what those looked like was like delivering her she provided me with social media copy, and I would basically turn those into graphics, really basic, nothing crazy. Like I use Canva, so it's not like anything insane. And I would turn those into graphics and then schedule them. And I would also provide her with some, like, platform insights. She'd be like, what are the new features on like Instagram, or how can we start Instagram lives? And so I would kind of advise her on best practices there. And I feel like for us, that kind of comes kind of naturally. So it's really fun to talk about it, and it's not super time consuming. And I just keep track of my hours using an app called Toggle, nothing crazy, really fancy. And what I like most about it is that it's very flexible. Like I can kind of do it on my own time. We communicate over Slack and meet like twice a month on Zoom. And so I can really work on it on the weekends, or if I have a little bit of time after work. And so I also feel like I'm learning a lot from it. Like I'm learning these platform insights that then I can take to my team at my PR job and be like, hey, I think we should explore like this TikTok feature. It could be really valuable for advertising or something like that. So overall, I love freelancing. I plan to definitely continue. She's also very considerate about like my actual job. So like I said, flexible in that regard. And I forgot to say what she is, but she's an author and like starting to get really successful, actually talks about grief, and specifically how it pertains to minority communities and from a Black perspective. So that's awesome. And her stuff is gaining a ton of traction. And so it's really fun. She's been published in like the New York Times, LA Times. So I love helping her elevate that on the digital space.
That's great. I was going to say, I thought I might have known the author, but then it's not Allison Gilbert, is it?
No, Allison was who I started off with at the View Project. And then she introduced me to Elisa Forneray. That's her name.
Just curious. Katie, Jack.
I can jump in a little bit more about my experience freelancing. It's actually funny to me that you said, you're talking about networking, but then freelancing, because to me, they're very intertwined in my experience with freelancing. I started freelancing within a volunteer role through GMA because of connection I made at the externship with Rich Batista. And that was really helpful. But kind of like what Grace mentioned, I think freelancing is very different when you're being paid versus when you're not being paid. And that distinction can really change, for example, how I do my work and like how I prioritize what I'm doing. But beyond that, the freelancing work I do, all of those opportunities I got either through networking or, like Grace said, because someone put my name in the running for something. And I think, especially in journalism, there's a lot of talk in freelancing about cold pitching, which is something that, works for a good number of people. But the reason it works is because you usually have a strong portfolio or something you can show to say, hey, I've done this before. And so getting your foot in the door, at least for me, has been really heavily based on knowing a couple of people who can vouch for me and can say like, oh, she does good work, like she would do well here. And cold pitching is a lot more challenging there. And within that, like I started working for the SFS magazine, and the person I was working for within the company was the one who connected me to do the social media freelancing because he heard I had that background. And so a lot of it is kind of bouncing off of people and like Grace said, the hardest part can sometimes be the balance between doing the freelancing and doing your full-time job. So making sure that, those things aren't going to conflict, or that you're going to have a flexible enough, area in both to make it work. It can be either, a bonus in terms of like some extra money, which is what it's been for me, and an outlet for me to be more creative in my writing, which is what I've tried to do. But in other experiences, like writing for my local paper, it's a way for me to get involved in my community and also get like a bigger portfolio. So I don't know. I feel like I answered your question with every answer there is under the sun, but freelancing can be a lot of what you make it out to be. And tied into networking, I figured out how I wanted to do my freelancing. And especially as a woman who, had a little bit of trouble with my confidence in a career, it's taught me a lot about like negotiating rates and knowing my worth and honestly, understanding very complicated taxes. That's a huge part of freelancing that I feel like no one really talks about. So, all that's to say is it's also not for everyone. I did freelancing a good amount of time before I had my full-time job, and I have a hard time keeping a schedule without, expectations from others or certain deadlines. And so I realized I couldn't do freelancing full-time, and I needed, a strict full-time job with, hours and meetings and expectations, and doing freelancing on the side in my free time worked out really well for me. So again, lots of different avenues and pathways for it, but it does allow for a lot of flexibility in a neat way, especially if you want to test something out or you have some opportunities through networking.
That's great. Yes, the networking and the freelancing piece I can see being very well matched. So after this question, after we finish up with Jack with your answer on freelancing, then we'll go into networking because they dovetail quite nicely.
Yeah, so as Katie said, freelancing, tons of forms, so much tax stuff all the time. I fill out forms like 3 times a week. It's ridiculous. I hate it. But my main job is freelancing, and part of being a production assistant is that you work on this contractual basis. Then you don't necessarily know if work is going to come. So it's really stressful when what you primarily do is freelance stuff. But something that's sort of nice about the industry is that when you do work, you work like I've worked 20 hours a day, 2 days in a row before. And while I come home and I scream into my pillow when that happens, it's nice because I make enough money that doing 40 hours in 2 days, that's another week of salary. So it's you build a buffer in the weeks that you work for weeks that you don't work, and that pairs nicely with me being able to do stand-up and to still have time to write for myself. Another thing that I've noticed about freelancing is that people will get sort of confused and just sort of accidentally promote you. One person decides if you get promoted. So I worked sort of as more of a production coordinator than a production assistant on this most recent job. And so now I can apply to be a production coordinator, and people will be like, okay, well, he's done it before. When usually you don't become a production coordinator 2-3 years after being a production assistant, and usually it's from somebody who you have been a production assistant for multiple times, and it comes because they get promoted to a production manager and now they hire production coordinators. That's generally the life cycle, but I got hired as this production coordinator piece because the company was based in Canada and they didn't really understand how it worked down here. But boom, that just became who I was. And now I can sort of ride that, and you can be much more strategic with what you're doing, I guess is what I'm trying to say, when you're a freelancer. And you can sort of move yourself forward as you see fit, as opposed to having to wait on someone giving a promotion if you were in a more traditional, rigid job structure.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And yeah, I'm glad that I'm kind of rolling into networking now, because everything that when I prompted you guys to talk about your freelancing, and I do want to, there's part of me that also wants to ask about all the tax the tax issues. I'm sure that is a stressful thing, and that's often a question that I get too. And I'm not going to ask you that because you're probably still trying to figure out what that means in terms of taxes. But so networking, right? So when students often come to see me first, they think of networking as very transactional, that you're an icky. So for me, it's relationship building. It's how I get to know alumni and understand their industries, and so I can better serve my students. So I certainly see it from the relationship building standpoint. So for you, who are so close to the process of having gone through it and are still doing it because you're freelancing right now, what would you advise students? And this is geared towards seniors, but seniors, sophomores, juniors, anyone who's watching this, what would you say about networking? Is it transactional? Is it necessary for your industry? What would you say? Any advice?
I would say that it is necessary for my industry. I would definitely say that. And what I've noticed, the best networking comes from when you can get the person to stop talking about their job. That's when people start to actually care about you. Like I was working for someone who I found out that his cousin swam with me in college. And so it was like this beautiful small world kind of thing. And now it's sort of like I'm different from the other PAs because he's more connected to me, and he taught me a lot of things. And when somebody teaches you something and then you immediately integrate it, like I worked for this guy for like 5 days, and each day I got noticeably better. And on the last day, he was like upset that I was leaving because it was like he knew me and he taught me things. So that's sort of how I try to go about my relationships. Is I try to learn, apply the learning, and also know the person. And then hopefully in the future they will help you out or you can help them out. Another thing that people really like is if they have someone that they are connected to, that is just randomly doing something, like they say something about like how their son wants to go and sell stuff in Africa or whatever, and your uncle sells stuff in Africa. If you can connect their son with your uncle, then like that means something to them a lot too. So sometimes it takes like you making the first step to really get if you want a transaction, to really get the transaction going.
Yeah, I loved how you were really talking about the relationship building part, because that's it. It was like you were interested in the person from the relationship standpoint, and then it grew from there. But it's something struck me earlier on too, because networking is so multifaceted. Is that for you, it's like you literally will walk up to people who are filming. So that is in essence another kind of networking too. You're being pretty proactive and taking a lot of initiative, and that's also part of networking as well. So, but your passion for what you do shines through too. So it's not something that's purely transactional. But there is an initiative to it.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Jack said. I think that when you're networking, you want to keep in mind that you don't want to just read off your resume. You want to make that personal connection. Like, for example, I was talking to someone from the Olympics, and she mentioned that she loves running and loves running marathons. And I told her that I was about to run a marathon in a few months. And she was like, "Oh my gosh, you have to keep me updated on how you do." And that was perfect, because then I could kind of send her an email every few weeks, kind of just nothing crazy, a short email, but letting her know about my progress. And while I wasn't necessarily asking a career related question or can you pass my resume along, she remembered me. And so then maybe I could use that connection in the future. And so I would also say that you want to think of networking as something that is like a longer term relationship too. Like, yes, you could be networking for a current job, but maybe you meet someone and you have a conversation that could be relevant to you in 5 years. And if you keep up with them, like I said, you're not sending them like long bios of your life, but if you update them every few months or just tell them something new that you're doing, that relationship could come in handy in the future for sure. And my last piece of advice would be that I don't know if anyone really loves networking. I definitely didn't like it at first. I was nervous for the phone calls. I was like, so awkward. What if you say something at the same time? You know what I mean? But it definitely gets a lot easier the more calls you have. And so then by the end, I felt a lot more comfortable just like jumping on a call with someone and asking them a few questions about their career.
I mean, I think I really want to touch on something Jackie said, and I try to say this when I talk to some undergrads, that like networking feels really icky when you start it. Like, I was super uncomfortable with it. It felt like high stakes when it wasn't, and like really unnatural to me. And Jackie would always recommend it, and I'd be like, oh, I don't know, that feels weird. And then I did it consistently and over, and for so many different reasons and in so many different ways. And now it feels not only really comfortable, but there's so many benefits to it. And something that Grace said that I think is also a really good point, is it's not really high stakes. Like it could be, you could have so many different expectations for it, but you could just be talking to someone to hear about what their career path was like. That's a lot of what, like, for example, the GMA externship is like, where you're not going into it thinking of it as, a transactional approach at all. And so again, it feels really uncomfortable. And I really want to underscore that discomfort, because it was something I really didn't like. But I, have used networking and networking phone calls in so many different ways, even with people like, there's no open positions at their company right now. And I just said, like they write really cool columns about gender, and that's something I'm interested in. I wonder how they got there. And even the reaching out feels weird, oh, you're also a Georgetown alum, like, let me send you a cold LinkedIn DM, and it feels odd, but more times than you'd think it works. And they really, people like to talk about themselves, and it's really nice to hear about their paths, and especially when it's not with any stakes of hoping that they'll pass your resume along. And the other thing that it really did help me for when I was applying to jobs too, is a lot of networking for me felt like interview prep and interview practice. I'm telling my little blurb in my story, and I'm hearing how they told their blurb in their story. And, you get some advice from them, but sometimes I've talked to people on the phone over networking where I've gotten 5 words in over 20 minutes because they just want to talk about their experience and what they think of the industry. And I don't know, I think we have ideas in our mind of what networking is supposed to look like, or what those phone calls look like, or getting coffee, and it can go in so many different directions and benefit you in a lot of ways. But the most challenging part is getting over the hurdle of how uncomfortable it can feel, and how, like, for me, it also felt like I was making inorganic connections. But like both Grace and Jack said, we're all human. We all have things in common. And whether it's something like, someone who knows someone, or even that, like, oh, I wrote for this paper and they like the things you write, there's so many different ways to do that. And I've done lots and lots of networking calls, and the important part of it is a lot of them also didn't work out. Like, I've kept in touch with people, but they get too busy, or so for me, volume really helped, and maintaining those relationships, like Grace said, like down the line, maybe I'll apply to this job at Axios, and I've talked to 2 people on the phone at Axios, or a couple of people who have switched jobs recently. You send them a congratulatory note where you're not expecting anything from them. You're not applying, you're just maintaining that relationship. So I don't know. There's lots of different ways to approach it, and I don't think it's a one size fits all. And also, starting it early, sophomore or junior year, if that's the grade you're in, where you're just doing it without any expectation of what it's like, and just getting over how it feels like a little bit iffy, can be really helpful, because then by the time you're looking for jobs that spring, you can do a bunch of phone calls. And speaking of, being on the job hunt, I, tried to get a certain number of job applications in each week, but I also scheduled, like, on average 5 networking phone calls. I try to do at least 1 a day. And it could be, oh, I'm applying to Mother Jones and I saw this alum works there, or just, oh, Jackie mentioned this person who spoke on a panel, maybe they'd be interested in talking to me. And just, doing it as often as you can, and getting used to it is the advice I would have around it.
So, I'm thinking of moving from like the relationship space to like the practical strategic, although this is all strategy. Networking is strategy, and it really is. It's part of the strategy. But I'm thinking of the skills space. For a lot of students, that like questions they'll ask is, are there skills I should highlight based on my particular industry? So I'm thinking of, Jack, when I think about production, it really depends on what it is that you do, but like any of the Adobe packages, Katie, journalism, I'm thinking maybe just good, solid writing skills, and Grace for PR and communications. Maybe social media analytics. So I'm just playing with possible hard skills, but I'm also thinking in the soft skills space. Like, what have you noticed that really kind of that worked? Or maybe in a hiring interview, they said, we took you because you were really good at X, or you found that after trying to, maybe Jack, for you, it's like trying to get a production role, and they're like, well, you don't have X skill. That could be helpful for students. So maybe if you could just talk a little bit about skills, anything that, given your industries, would be helpful for students.
So the number one thing with being a production assistant, what I've gathered is, if you want it so badly, they'll just give it to you. They don't really care. Like, it's not hard to be a production assistant. You just sort of stand there half the time. But if you walk onto set on the middle of the street and you say, let me be on it, like, I want to learn, I want to do this so badly, they will, like, they'll be like, let's give him a shot. Like, I, like, nothing, like, it's the stakes are pretty low for being a production assistant. Half of the job is standing there and being like, don't walk onto set, random person, and ruin the shot. And the other half of it is getting people coffee. It's not super hard. So if you are interesting and you want it, that's more or less like enough to sort of get it.
And that jives with me what I've heard with production assistant roles. That I guess the skill would be geographically you got to be there. So
Yeah,
it's not
no.
necessarily a skill, I suppose, but I think you have to be in the area. So if you want to be in LA and work in LA, you got to be there. So it's not about applying in advance. It's got to be like you got to be there.
You have to move there first. That's 100% true. If you're not in the area, no one's going to say, okay, I'll hire you and then you move. No, people don't like that. So yeah, you have to be in the area. You have to move there first.
I would say that my piece of advice and what I've found to be successful is to really have a strong understanding of your why. So when you're in an interview or networking with someone, you can really tie in that why to your story and your background. So the person very clearly understands why you want to do this job, because maybe like to me, I'm like, oh yeah, I know why. But if you don't vocalize that, sometimes that it doesn't get across, even if you think it does. I know I had to learn that. And I had something else I was about to say. I was going to say, this is a little more interview specific, but like when you can, it's awesome to be able, and if it's within your industry, to kind of quantify your work and what you've done. So like whether that is analytics, Jackie, you were exactly right. In PR, analytics is growing every single day. I know we have our analytics practice and it's so needed across any kind of ask, any kind of client. So specifically in PR, if you can kind of show that you're able to quantify a success of a digital campaign or an earned campaign, that's really helpful.
I think the hard skills, soft skills distinction is also an interesting part of it, because I think for me, in quantifying some of the hard skills, like, you know, your background in writing and, you know, your portfolio, all those different things, sometimes it's really hard to tell where you're supposed to be at a certain point. And so like, you know, whether you are a good writer or you have enough experience, all of that is like super subjective. So like, you know, doing as much as you can where you can, you know, within reason and taking care of yourself is like always my big push. Every writing opportunity you get, take it. Like, you know, really, you know, push to make your portfolio as wide as possible, and things that I think Grace was saying with your why that you're excited about. But beyond that, for me in freelancing and in my full-time job, something that I think I undervalued about myself that I'm seeing as really benefiting me is just attitude. And it sounds kind of silly because it's not something that, you know, necessarily requires you to have practiced a lot, but it just something basic is like, if I'm asked to do a task, I like respond with enthusiasm and put my all into it. And at first I thought like, oh, that's kind of like, you know, the bare minimum, they're scraping the bottom of the, but I've gotten responses that's like, thank you for doing this in a timely manner and with, you know, meeting my expectations and being excited about it. And that's something that to me feels like it's an easy step to take, but it's really valuable and vital. Part of that also in terms of attitude comes with taking criticism. The first freelance piece I pitched, the first freelance piece I worked on was 3,000 words, required 5 interviews. It took me weeks to write, and I sent it in, and the editors just did not like it. And part of it was their expectations weren't clear. Like it wasn't even fully things to do with me, but they just didn't like it. And the person I've been working with who was mediating it said like, you know, they didn't like it, but you know, do you want to rewrite it? Like, how would you feel about that? And I said, well, yeah, I put all this work into it. And, you know, I didn't hit it the first time, but this is my first freelance piece. And if I gave up now, like, what's the point? And I went, you know, through with it and I sent it in and got feedback from the person I was working with that the people said they were impressed with my professionalism and my willingness to just take criticism and run with it. Because, you know, again, to me, that feels like something that's not super hard to do, but it is so important and undervalued, and making sure that like you're putting your all into whatever it is you're doing. You know, I'm doing comms, which isn't my dream job, but I'm putting my all into it with the idea that I'll get the best experience I can, and I'll have people who can vouch for me in my next position. All of that is important. And, you know, that doesn't mean faking it all the time. Like that's not what I'm trying to get at, but, you know, doing the best you can and putting your all into everything when you can, again, I think is like really undervalued, and something that I try to keep, you know, the forefront of my mind, even when I'm kind of annoyed. And a lot of it is like easier to do in the online world, quite honestly. Like you get something you're not excited about and you can just kind of hide it. But either way, I think that's very important.
Wow. Thanks, guys. I'm looking at time and I can't believe it, but we're at like 12:50. So we have about 5 minutes left. I'm not sure. Katie might have her connection might have dropped. So she might be back, but I'm thinking in the last 5 minutes or just in the time left, I do have other questions, but I'm wondering if there's anything, maybe any final advice that you might have. And I'm thinking the students I'm seeing now are really panicked. So it's April, and you can imagine like putting yourself in their shoes. They're worried that they don't have a job. Maybe realistically, what does that look like? When did you get your job? And it sounds like, you know, for Jack, it was freelancing. Grace, you started interning like even in the fall. So it wasn't right away. So if you want to leave us with any final pieces of advice for seniors who might be a little bit nervous now. Hi, Katie, you're back. Katie just said, is there any last piece of advice that any of you had for seniors who are really nervous? Because this is usually the time where people start getting really panicked about not having work, not having jobs. So any last kind of thoughts or advice that any of you would have?
I would say you're gonna have to make a risk at some point. Like with me, it was moving to New York, and then it was walking on set and introducing myself. Like for some people, it might be like networking for the first time, or it might be like something I can't even fathom. But like you'll probably have to take a risk. Like we're leaving. You guys are leaving college, and that's a risk in itself. And just don't be scared to take that risk, because that's how you get your job started.
Yeah, I guess my piece of advice would be, I know it's easier said than done, but to be flexible and open to opportunities that present themselves to you, because so much has changed. I know that we pick a major and then we want to stick with it, but you might find that something else is pulling you towards a different field, or your interests lie somewhere else, and it's okay to change. I know for me, I think I've had conversations with you, Jackie, about being an Arabic and government major. I was like, I feel constrained. I don't know how I'm going to break into another industry. And so that's why I emphasized why your why is so important, because it took some time, but I kind of like crafted a story as to like why and how my Arabic and government major can help me in the field I'm looking into. And I believe that there is a website on Georgetown's page that kind of has all the majors and then kind of outlines like broad skills that they give you. And I actually found that to be really helpful in kind of crafting that why I want to be here, even though it's not necessarily a linear path.
I think very similarly to what Grace said in establishing your why, I spent a lot of time after graduation figuring out what was most important to me. And that was both career-wise and like personally, like what city I wanted to be in, what values I have that are really important to me. And honestly, just like wrote them out and wrote them down, and helped, you know, make that checklist when I was looking at jobs that maybe I wasn't originally interested in, and said, you know, would I be comfortable, for example, in communications, doing messaging for this organization? And that really helped me evaluate, you know, and put myself in a position where it's not ideal. It's not exactly what I want to do, but it's not also a position I'm in where I'm like, you know, hating every day of my job. And then I feel like this is kind of obvious, but I really want to underscore that as much as, you know, Georgetown and the culture really underscores the importance of a career, like your life is so much more than your career, and there's so many ways you can get fulfillment, obviously outside of your primary job, like we were talking about with freelancing, but also, you know, through your relationships, through your hobbies, through all these other things, and making sure that you're enriching all those areas of your life. It also makes it easier to maybe do a job that isn't your ideal, or help you get to the next step by taking care of kind of your whole self alongside your career aspirations and your personal aspirations.
Well, that brings us to 12:54. Can you believe it? 1 minute before I said that I would allow all of you to go back to your lives, your 1 o'clock lives, whatever that looks like. So I want to thank you so much for joining me for this lunch hour chat. It's been so helpful to hear all of your stories and just to learn what that graduation to job process looked like. And I know it's not an easy one, because I've walked beside you for many of you and have seen it myself. So, and you are all doing so wonderful. So thank you so much. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Jackie.